Okay. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. It's involved in basically movement, interpreting sensory information, as well as maintaining homeostasis and functions that are related to the mind. So these are some of the general functions of the central nervous system. Brain and spinal cord is what we refer to as the central nervous system. So you can break down, you can basically categorize three functions in the central nervous system. Motor functions include stimulation of muscle cell contraction or secretion of a gland by a particular hormone. And that's, again, a function of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Because those axons and neuron cell bodies lie outside the brain and spinal cord. So they're called a part of the peripheral nervous system. Sensory functions refers to detection of sensations within and outside the body. And that's also a delegated function of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Now, the third function of the central nervous system is integrative functions. And this is basically the decision-making processes of the brain and spinal cord. And that's exclusive to the central nervous system. So what are some of these integrative functions? One is interpreting sensory information that's received by the body, planning and executing movement and monitoring movement, maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis refers to, the status quo, the normal body temperature, normal blood pH, the normal glucose concentrations. So that's what we refer to as homeostatic mechanisms, and that is basically centered in the central nervous system, particularly in an area that we'll look at later called the hypothalamus. It also relates to higher mental activities like language and learning functions. Those are also considered integrative. What does the brain look like? It's soft and kind of a whitish gray appearance, and it rests in the cranial cavity, weighs between 1250 and 1450 grams. It's mostly nerve tissue, but it also contains epithelial connective tissues. The cavities within the brain, the limited cavities that are present, are called the ventricles, and they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. They receive about 20% of the total blood flow during rest, and that's a high percentage of blood flow as a total percentage of total cardiac output, and that reflects the huge requirements that the brain needs for its nutrients and glucose and its oxygen. So the cerebrum is the enlarged superior portion of the brain. And it's divided into two lobes, the right and left cerebral hemisphere. Each hemisphere is then further divided into 5 lobes, each lobe containing a specific function. The cerebral hemisphere is the area responsible for your higher mental activities like learning, memory, personality, cognition, thinking, language, and conscience. It also performs major roles in both sensation as well as movement. Now, the diencephalon, the second division of the brain, is deep underneath the cerebral hemispheres, and it lies at the very central core of the brain. The diencephalon is comprised of 4 distinct structural and functional parts. It includes the thalamus and hypothalamus and pineal and pituitary gland. So these structures are responsible for processing and relaying information to different parts of the brain, as well as integrating that information. Homeostatic functions are also responsibility of the diencephalon, regulation of movement, particularly the thalamus, and your biological rhythms or circadian rhythms. When we go to bed at night and when we are awake during the day. Those are what we refer to as our biological rhythms or circadian rhythms. Okay, the third division of the brain, we talked about the cerebrum. Now we're going to talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the posterior and inferior region of the brain. It's divided into 2 left and right cerebellar hemispheres. The cerebellum is important in planning and coordination of movement, especially many of the complex activities like playing a sport or playing an instrument. And then the last division of the brain, we mentioned the cerebrum, we mentioned the brainstem, we mentioned the cerebellum, and we mentioned the diencephalon. Now let's concentrate on the brainstem. The brainstem is what connects the brain to the lower spinal cord. It's involved in involuntary homeostatic functions, reflexes, movement, monitoring, as well as integrating and relaying information to other parts of the central nervous system. So looking at this table, you can see the four basic divisions of the brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon in blue. The cerebrum, of course, is the majority of the brain. As you can see, it's this part that's colored kind of a light beige. Cerebellum is this area inferior to the cerebrum, which is important for monitoring and coordinating movement. And then finally, the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Of course, the brainstem works with the diencephalon in maintaining homeostasis, controlling many of your reflexes, monitoring movement, as well as integrating and relaying information to other parts of the brain. Now, the spinal cord is the inferior region of the central nervous system. It is a long tubular organ enclosed within your protective vertebral cavity. It blends with the inferior portion of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, and then it terminates between L1 and L2, the first and second lumbar vertebra. It's approximately 17 to 18 inches in length and about a quarter to a half inch in diameter. And in the very middle of the spinal cord is the central canal. And this is the internal cavity within the spinal cord, continuous with the brain's ventricles and filled with cerebral spinal fluid. There's two types of tissue in the central nervous system that we'll describe. One is called white matter, and of course it's found in both the brain and the spinal cord, and it's white because it consists of myelinated axons. Myelin gives a kind of a yellowish, whitish color when you look at it grossly. So that's how they derive the term white matter. Each lobe of the cerebrum will contain bundles of white matter in the central nervous system of the brain is called tracts. And these tracts will receive input from and send output to cell bodies. And dendrites in the cerebral gray matter referred to as the nuclei. The spinal cord contains white matter tracts that then shuttle that information that's processed by the nuclei in the spinal cord, gray matter. And then the other tissue, the gray matter, found in both the brain and the spinal cord, will consist of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons, and that gives the appearance of a kind of a grayish color. So the outer few millimeters of the cerebrum is gray matter. So it's going to consist mainly of unmyelinated axons and neuron cell bodies. And the deeper portions of the brain matter are mostly white matter, with some gray matter scattered throughout. The spinal cord is mostly gray matter in the central core of the spinal cord that processes the information. And that's then surrounded by white matter on the outside, which then relays that information to the other regions of the brain. So the communication between the gray and white matter will connect the different regions of the brain and spinal cord with each other. The myelinated axons also enables almost instantaneous communication between the locations. And that's the reason when patients come down with these demyelinating disorders, they lose the communication that causes absent reflexes. And, so also remember the organization of the gray and white matter in the brain and spinal cord is reversed, where spinal white matter is superficial, while it's actually deep in the brain. And reverse is also true. Spinal gray matter is deep, whereas cerebral gray matter is superficial. So here's a cutout showing you the brain frontal view showing you the white matter on the inside and the gray matter on the superficial area. You can see the cutout on the right where you can see the spinal cord from that transverse section, the gray matter being on the inside of the figure and the white matter being on the outside. So the gray and white matter reverse their positions. The gray matter in the brain is superficial, whereas the gray matter in the spinal cord is deep, whereas the white matter is deep in the brain and the white matter is superficial in the spinal cord. Let's look at the embryonic development of the central nervous system. Both the brain and spinal cord develop from the neural tube with an enlarged end in the embryo of the fetus. That's called the neural tube. It's a hollow tube from which most of the nervous tissue will develop. It's completely developed by the 4th week of gestation. The caudal end of the neural tube forms the spinal cord. The cranial end forms the 3 primary brain vesicles, which become the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. And then the cavity within the neural tube becomes the ventricles in the brain and the central canal in the spinal cord. So your primary brain vesicles then give rise to 5 secondary brain vesicles by the 5th week of gestation. The secondary brain vesicles create 4 divisions of the mature brain. The forebrain eventually becomes 2 secondary brain vesicles called the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon will become the mature cerebral hemispheres. And of course, the diencephalon retains its name in the mature brain. And then the secondary, the other secondary brain vesicles are the midbrain, which expands into the secondary brain vesicle called the mesencephalon, which then develops into the mature midbrain. And then the hindbrain develops into 2 secondary brain vesicles called the metencephalon and myelencephalon. These will develop into the remainder of the brainstem, which consists of the pons, medulla, and the midbrain. The metencephalon will then mature and become the cerebellum, whereas the myelencephalon will become the medulla oblongata. So this is how the neural tube develops in the very early embryo into the 3 primary brain vesicles, the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Secondary vesicles develop from the 3 primary vesicles. Forebrain becomes the telencephalon and diencephalon. Telencephalon then becomes the cerebrum in the adult. The diencephalon will keep its name in the adult brain. The mesencephalon is derived from the midbrain. Remember the 2 M's, M midbrain, M for midbrain, M for mesencephalon. The mesencephalon then becomes the midbrain portion of the brainstem. And in the 3rd primary brain vesicle, the hindbrain, becomes the 2 secondary brain vesicles, metencephalon and myencephalon. The metencephalon becomes the pons of the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata, which is the inferior part of the brainstem. So that's an overview of the embryonic development of the brain. Okay, the surface of the brain is going to have unique features. The cerebrum, of course, is the structure responsible for all of your higher mental functions. And some of the gross anatomical features include these grooves and ridges called sulci and gyri, or gyrus for singular. Sulci are the shallow grooves on the surface of the cerebrum, and gyri, or gyrus, or singular, is an elevated ridge down between the sulci. Okay? And then you have deep grooves called fissures, and they're found also on the surface of the cerebrum. The deepest of the fissures are the longitudinal fissures, and these are the grooves that separate the left and right cerebral hemispheres. And you have cavities found deep within each cerebral hemisphere. The right hemisphere surrounds the right lateral ventricle, and the left hemisphere surrounds the left lateral ventricle. So this is a superior view of the cerebrum, showing you the the superficial features of the cerebrum, the central sulcus, which basically separates the anterior frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, the precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and then the frontal lobe. Of course, the longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres. Okay, so 5 lobes are found in each hemisphere of the cerebrum. These are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and finally the insula. Okay, and this is just another view showing you the cerebrum. So the frontal lobes, the posterior border of the frontal lobe is the central, it's basically called the central sulcus, which sits just posterior to the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe where you find the primary motor cortex. So these neurons in the primary motor cortex will be responsible for basically planning and executing movement, and the rest of the frontal lobe is important for some of the complex mental activities like behavior, conscience, and personality. Behavior, conscience, and personality. Another lobe in the cerebrum is the parietal lobe. It contains the postcentral gyrus, just posterior to the central sulcus. These neurons in the parietal lobes are responsible for processing and integrating sensory information. And also they function in attention. And then the temporal lobes, these form the lateral surfaces of each cerebral hemisphere, and they're separated from the parietal and frontal lobes by the lateral fissure. And these neurons in the temporal lobes are involved in hearing, language, memory, and emotion. Okay. The occipital lobe is on the posterior aspect of each hemisphere, and they're separated by the parietal lobes by the parietal occipital sulcus. And these neurons in the occipital lobe will process all information related to vision. Now the fifth lobe, which you don't see from the surface, are the insulas, and they're deep underneath the lateral fissures. So you have to retract the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes to actually see the insulas. These neurons are thought to be involved in functions related to both taste and your internal visceral organs, like when you have an upset stomach, GI upset, or chest pain, or heartburn. So these are your 5 lobes. Your insula, which is basically deep to the other lobes, frontal lobe, central sulcus being the demarcation between frontal and parietal lobes, occipital lobe separated by the parietal lobe by the parietal occipital sulcus, and then the temporal lobe, and then it's separated by the frontal and parietal lobes by the lateral fissure, and then you see the insula deep to the temporal and frontal lobes. So your gray matter in the cerebral cortex is functionally the most complex part of the cerebrum, of the cortex, and it covers the underlying cerebral hemispheres. Most of the cerebral cortex is called neocortex. It's called neocortex because it's thought to be the most recently evolved region of the brain. And it's where you find the highest surface area. The neocortex is composed of 6 layers of neurons and neuroglial cells, and they'll have variable widths. And all these neurons are basically called interneurons. So your cerebral gray matter, their functions of these neocortical neurons revolve around conscious processes like planning movements, interpreting incoming sensory information, that's what we refer to as perception, and some of your complex higher mental activities like abstract thought, logic. Neocortex is also divided into 3 areas: a primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex, and then the association areas. The primary motor cortex is where movement is planned and executed. The primary sensory cortex, those are your first regions to receive and process sensory input from the body. And then finally, the association areas will integrate the different types of information. They're subdivided into unimodal areas, which integrate only one specific type of information, and the multimodal areas, which integrate information from multiple areas or sources, and they carry out many of the higher mental activities. So this is a colored image showing you the different lobes of the brain with the primary motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, the association areas associated with their respective lobes. Everything that you see in yellow is association, and everything, that's what we call multimodal association, because it can be associated with more than one type of task. Whereas the orange areas are the unimodal association areas. They're only associated with one task at hand. You can see the primary visual cortex, that's on the very posterior part of the occipital lobe, and then the primary auditory cortex, which receives frequencies of sound waves, that's what's responsible for hearing. That's located in that blue area on the superior part of the temporal lobe. And then the auditory association cortex in orange, when, let's say, a frequency is received by the primary auditory cortex, is then compared to a previous sound by the auditory association cortex. So that's how you perceive a particular sound. You'll notice that in each lobe where there's a primary area, there will also be an association area that is related to the primary area. But the association areas are more for analyzing the information, whereas the primary areas are more noted for receiving the information. So motor areas, these are mostly found in your frontal lobe of the cerebrum. They contain the upper motor neurons, which are all classified as interneurons that connect to other neurons. They do not connect to the skeletal muscle cells. That's why they're referred to as upper motor neurons. The neurons that actually contract the skeletal muscle would be referred to as lower motor neurons. And we use these distinctions many times to characterize certain diseases of the nervous system. Like an upper motor neuron disease would be a disease that maybe affects the brain. When a person has a brain tumor, they'll have upper motor neuron symptoms. So your primary motor cortex, involved in conscious planning of movement, located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. The upper motor neurons of each hemisphere will actually control motor activity of the opposite side of the body. It does that via the peripheral nervous system neurons called the lower motor neurons. That's where they execute the order to move. Movement also requires input from unimotor association areas, and that's when you have this large premotor cortex anterior to the primary motor cortex. The motor association areas are unimodal areas involved in planning, guidance, coordination, execution of movement, and then anterior to these are your frontal eye fields, which are paired motor association areas, one on each side of the brain anterior to the premotor cortex, and this is responsible for back and forth eye movements, like when you're reading a book from left to right. You have two main somatosensory areas in the cerebral cortex, and these deal with your somatic senses. Somatic senses include information about temperature, touch, vibration, pressure, stretch, and joint position. Primary somatosensory area S1 is in your postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. Somatosensory association cortex S2 is basically just posterior to it, okay, to the S1. And then the special senses, these refer to your touch, vision, hearing, smell, and taste. Each will have a primary and a unimodal association area, as well as the sense of equilibrium or balance. And these are found in all lobes of the cortex except for the frontal lobe. The primary visual cortex is located at the posterior end of the occipital lobe, and this is the first area to receive visual input, which is then transferred to the visual association area. And this is where color, object movement, and depth are then processed. Okay. The primary auditory cortex is located in the superior temporal lobe, and this is the area that receives auditory information. That input is then transferred to the adjacent auditory association cortex and the other multimodal association areas to be further processed. The gustatory cortex is another special sense, and this is where taste information processing occurs. And is scattered throughout both the insula as well as the parietal lobes. The vestibular areas will deal with equilibrium, balance, and positional sensation, and is located in both the parietal as well as the temporal lobes. And then the olfactory cortex processes the sense of smell, and this is thought to be in the evolutionary older region of the brain. It also consists of several areas in the limbic and medial temporal lobes. So here's that multicolored view showing you the surface features of the brain, with the primary motor cortex outlined in red, primary somatosensory cortex outlined in blue. Orange, you find the unimodal association areas, which they're delegated to one task, and the multimodal association areas in yellow, these are delegated to multiple tasks. Okay, so the multimodal association areas, these are the regions of the cortex that allow us to perform many of our complex mental functions. Language is a very complex mental activity. It's processed in two areas of the cortex. One is found in the frontal lobe called Broca's area. And it's actually a premotor area in the anterolateral frontal lobe. And it's responsible for our ability to produce speech sounds, elocution, articulating words, finding the right word for the right meaning, symbolism. Wernicke area, or integrative speech area, this is located in the temporal and parietal lobes. And this area is responsible for our ability to understand language. And we'll talk about this also a little bit later. The prefrontal cortex is another multimodal association area. It occupies most of the frontal lobe. It also communicates with the diencephalon, other regions of the cerebral gray matter, as well as the other association areas located in the other lobes. Some of the functions include modulating behavior, personality, learning, memory, and an individual's personality state or their disposition. We've seen people that have had head injuries from head-on collisions that once they had this head injury, it basically sometimes changed their disposition, their personality after the head-on collision, where their prefrontal lobe was damaged, and they had quite severe injury to those areas, and that basically caused a personality change in many of these patients. And I've witnessed this firsthand in my medical practice. Parietal and temporal association areas, these are multimodal areas that occupy those respective lobes. Some of the functions include integrating sensory information, language, maintaining attention, recognition, and spatial awareness. So this is a summary of your motor, sensory, and association areas of the cerebral cortex. I'll let y'all review that. Okay, now let's look at the cerebral gray matter. The basal nuclei, these are found deep within each cerebral hemisphere. They're clusters of neuron cell bodies. They're involved in movement. They regulate movement. Their movement is initiated by neurons in the primary motor cortex. But you also have unwanted movements that have to be filtered out so that you have a fluid movement in your voluntary command center in your primary motor cortex. So they're separated from the diencephalon by a region of white matter referred to as the internal capsule. And the three basal nuclei are the caudate nuclei, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. caudate nucleus and putamen. Those are sometimes referred together as the striate nuclei, and then the globus pallidus is medial to the other two. So the caudate nuclei, they're C-shaped rings of gray matter, C for caudate nuclei. They're lateral to the lateral ventricles of each hemisphere with an anteriorly oriented tail. They're connected to the putamen, which is posterior and inferior to the caudate nucleus, and is connected to the caudate nucleus by small bridges of gray matter. So we refer to these two nuclei as a corpus striatum. And then the third basal nuclei, the globus pallidus, is just medial to the putamen. It's basically inhibitory to the primary motor cortex, whereas the caudate nucleus and putamen are excitatory. So here's an image showing you the globus pallidus lying medial to the corpus striatum, which are the caudate nucleus, and the putamen. Okay, now let's look at cerebral white matter. We've discussed cerebral gray matter. Now let's take a look at cerebral white matter. They're classified in one of three types. The commissure fibers, these connect your right and left hemispheres. The corpus callosum is your largest of the commissural fibers. They're found in the middle of the brain at the base of the longitudinal fissure. Second group of cerebral white matter fibers are the projection fibers, which connect the cerebral cortex of one hemisphere with other areas in the same hemisphere, as well as other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. An example of projection fibers are the corona radiata, which come from the internal capsule, and they basically generally project from one area of the central nervous system to a higher region. And then the third region, the third group of fibers are the commissural fibers, and they basically take information from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. And like they said, the largest of those groups are the corpus callosum. Those are the largest groups of commissural fibers. And this allows the right hemisphere to communicate with the left hemisphere. So let's look at a possible potential pathway for information that's transferred by conduction of an action potential from one region of the brain to another. So first, the action potential originates in gray matter. Remember, action potentials have to originate from the gray matter because that's the neuron cell body. The action potential is then sent to another area of the gray matter by projection fibers. Then a second new action potential is generated by gray matter. And then it spreads to the neighboring gray matter by association fibers, but they're restricted to the same hemisphere. And then lastly, a third action potential is generated by commissural fibers, and then the information then can be communicated with the other hemisphere by these commissural fibers. So here your action potential is being generated in the gray matter of the thalamus, and then it travels to the gray matter in the same lobe. Then a second action potential then travels to another area of gray matter by these green association fibers. Remember, they're restricted to the same hemisphere. And then a new action potential is generated and sent to the neighboring gray matter by the association fibers. And then another action potential then is generated and then sent to the opposite hemisphere by the commissural fibers. So first you have your projection fibers, your association fibers, and then your commissural fibers. Okay, so that's your three fiber types, and that allows communication between multiple areas of the brain. The limbic system is a very important functional brain system. It includes the limbic lobe, which is a region of the medial cerebrum, the hippocampus, amygdala, and their pathways. What they do is they connect each of the regions of the gray matter with the rest of the brain. You only find limbic systems within mammalian brains. They're involved in four basic functions. One is memory, learning, emotion, and behavior. The limbic system is actually the last part of the central nervous system, the part of the brain to develop. Okay, and it actually isn't completely developed or mature until about age 25 in human beings. So it's the last part of the central nervous system to develop in the brain. The limbic lobe and their associated structures, they form a ring on the medial side of each hemisphere, and they contain two main gyri, the cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is located just above the corpus callosum. The hippocampus is located in the temporal lobe. It's also connected to another prominent C-shaped ring of white matter called the fornix, which is its main output tract. It's involved in memory and learning. And then the amygdala, anterior to the hippocampus, is involved in behavior and expression of emotion, especially the emotion of fear. So here's an image showing you the structures of the limbic system. You can see the cingulate gyri, the parahippocampal gyri, the fornix, and then the diencephalon and the amygdala in purple. So that's the limbic system, especially important for memory, emotion, personality, and planning. Now let's look at the diencephalon. We've talked about the cerebrum. Now we're going to look at the diencephalon. It's the physical center of the brain. It's composed of four components, each with their own nuclei that receive specific input and then send output to the other regions of the brain. The four regions of the diencephalon are the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and subthalamus. The thalamus is your largest of the structures. It's the main entry route of all sensory data into the cerebral cortex. It consists of two egg-shaped regions of gray matter, which make up about 80% of the diencephalon. Your third ventricle is found between those two regions. And the thalamic nuclei receive sensory or afferent fibers from many of the other regions of the central nervous system, excluding information about the sense of smell. But all the other special senses like hearing, vision, vestibular, those are all going to be relayed in the thalamus. So here's the structure of the diencephalon from the frontal view. You see the pineal gland, which is inferior, the thalamus, the two egg-shaped structures. On the anterior view, you can see the mammillary bodies, the hypothalamus, the subthalamus. So your thalamus regulates cortical activity by controlling which input should continue on to the cerebral cortex. And by the way, approximately 80 to 90% of the input is actually filtered out. So you're only receiving about 10% of the incoming input. Each half of the thalamus has three main groups of nuclei, which are then separated by thin layers of white matter. And the white matter are usually the output tracts. You also have specific nuclei in the thalamus that function as relay stations. These receive input, integrate information, and then send that information to their specific motor or sensory areas in the cerebrum. So the association nuclei in the thalamus receive input from a variety of sources. They process information related to emotion, memory, and sensory information integration. That processed information then is sent on to its appropriate association area of the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus serves as a kind of a sorting out area. The nonspecific nuclei, they usually receive information from the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, and the motor cortex. So they're going to be primarily being associated with motor functions. They send information into a wide range of locations, including the cerebrum and the other brain regions. They're involved in controlling arousal, consciousness, level of responsiveness, and excitability of the cerebrum. Those are referred to as the non-specific nuclei. The hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei anterior and inferior to the larger thalamus. Those neurons are very important for several vital functions critical to survival, which include regulation of your autonomic nervous system, your sleep-wake cycle, your biological rhythms, your thirst, hunger, and your sexual drives, and your body temperature regulation. The inferior hypothalamus is anatomically and functionally linked to the pituitary gland by an extension of tissue called the infundibulum, and it's the hypothalamic tissue that makes up the posterior part of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus secretes a number of different releasing and inhibiting hormones that affect the anterior pituitary gland. In turn, the pituitary gland then secretes hormones that affects the activities of other endocrine glands, which are the target organs throughout the body. The two hormones made also in the hypothalamus are antidiuretic hormone, usually abbreviated ADH, and oxytocin. These are hypothalamic hormones that do not affect the pituitary gland, but they have their effect on water balance and stimulation of uterine contraction during childbirth. Their input to the hypothalamus arise from many sources, including the cortex and the basal nuclei. The mammillary bodies, these connect the hypothalamus with the limbic system. And they also receive input from the hippocampus. So they're heavily involved in memory regulation and behavior. Input from outside this nervous system, the endocrine system, provides information also from receptors that detect changes in body temperature and receptors that detect changes in osmotic concentration of the blood. So they're called osmoreceptors. So your osmolality of your blood is regulated by the hypothalamus. The epithalamus, which is superior to the thalamus, it contains a gland called the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, which is a hormone involved in your sleep-wake cycle. And then the subthalamus, inferior to the thalamus, it's functionally connected with the basal nuclei, and together they help control movement. So this is an image of the diencephalon from a mid-sagittal view, showing you the pineal gland, the epithalamus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, infundibulum, pituitary. Notice the demarcation in the pituitary. You can see it right about here. Okay, this would be the posterior pituitary gland and behind the red line, and the anterior pituitary anterior to the red line. And the brainstem is also associated with the diencephalon, but it lies inferior to the diencephalon. Now the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the posterior inferior portion of the brain. It's functionally connected with the cerebral cortex, as well as the basal nuclei, brainstem, and the spinal cord. So those interactions between those regions help coordinate movement. Anatomically, you have two cerebellar hemispheres connected in the middle by the vermis, a structure called the vermis. And you also have unique features, unique ridges called folia that cover the exterior cerebellar surface, which also extends surface area, and they're separated by the shallow sulci. So this is just a posterior view of the cerebellum, showing you the deep cerebellar nuclei, cerebellar peduncles. These are white matter output tracts, and then you have the posterior lobe and anterior lobe that are visible. You can see the brainstem and diencephalon on the superior edge of the image. So you have three lobes in the cerebellum, okay? Anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular. The cerebellar cortex is the outer gray matter layer. So the cortex is extremely folded, and you also have a branching white matter that lies deep, which is called the arbor vitae, because it resembles tree branches. It literally comes from the Latin term tree of life. That's how we get the term arbor vitae. So here's your posterior lobe, anterior lobe, cerebellar peduncles, and the flocculonodular lobe. The cerebellar peduncles provide a connection to the brainstem, between the cerebellum and the brainstem. So you have an inner white matter containing the deep cerebellar nuclei, which is gray matter scattered throughout. And then you have white matter that converges into three large tracts called the cerebellar peduncles. This is the only connection between the cerebellum and the brain. So here's a parasagittal section of the cerebellum from an illustration on the left, where you can see the arbor vitae and the middle cerebellar peduncles, the cerebellar cortex, the gray area on the outside of the arbor vitae, medulla oblongata, and pons portion of the brainstem. And then on the right side, you see a photograph of the cerebellum, and you can see the arbor vitae very clearly, the pons, medulla oblongata, which are basically labeled. Now, the last area, the last division of the brain, we've talked about the cerebrum, we've talked about the diencephalon, we've talked about the cerebellum. Now we're going to talk about the brainstem. The brainstem is probably one of the oldest components of the brain, evolutionary speaking. It's very important for our immediate survival because these nuclei control many of our basic homeostatic functions, such as heart rate and our breathing rhythms, our ventilation patterns. They also control many reflexes. A reflex is a programmed automatic response to a stimulus. They also function in movement, sensation, and maintaining alertness. Okay. So it's located inferior to the diencephalon, but anterior to the cerebellum and superior to the spinal cord. It extends to the level of the foramen magnum, along with the fourth ventricle, which is very deep within the brainstem, and then continuous with the spinal cord and its central canal. So here's a mid-sagittal section of the brain showing you the different regions of the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And that's a mid-sagittal section of the brain, of a cadaver brain, showing you the brainstem. So the three subdivisions, the superior midbrain, the middle pons, and the inferior medulla oblongata, where you find several structures. The fibers of the cerebellum and their related nuclei will travel through portions of the brainstem where they either synapse with nuclei found in the brainstem, or they progress to other destinations in either the cerebral cortex or the spinal cord. You also find the brainstem, what we call the nuclei of reticular formation. They're a group of connected nuclei scattered throughout all regions of the brainstem. Some of the functions include regulation of respiration, blood pressure, the sleep-wake cycle, pain perception, and consciousness. Of note, the nuclei of the reticular formation are what are anesthetized during general anesthesia. When a person has to have an operation, for example, and they have to have general anesthesia, drugs like sodium pentothal and sufentanil, these can actually suppress the nuclei of the reticular formation and basically suppress these areas, and that's how they render the person unconscious. Also, you find in the brainstem tracts of white matter between the spinal cord and brain, and then the cranial nerve nuclei. Many of your cranial nerve nuclei will reside in different regions of the brainstem, and these will all have either sensory motor or autonomic responsibilities. So here's the external anatomy of the brainstem, showing the anterior view on the left and the posterior view on the right. You can see the diencephalon on the superior view and the medulla oblongata on the inferior view. So the midbrain, which is inferior to the diencephalon, surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, the cerebral aqueduct, of course, connects your third and fourth ventricles. Also referred to as the mesencephalon, it's the shortest and most superior portion of the brainstem region. Also in the midbrain you have these nuclei called the superior and inferior colliculi, which protrude from the posterior surface of the brainstem. Sometimes these nuclei are called the corpora quadrigemini. But these two paired projections form the roof of the midbrain, or the tectum, and they're involved in visual and auditory functions, and they project their fibers onto the thalamus. And these are going to be very important structures that play a very big role in what we'll call the startle reflex, which allows you to respond to an immediate danger, also almost instantaneously. If you didn't have these reflexive patterns of, 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 of connections in the brainstem, you might not be able to respond quickly to an immediate threat or danger. And then also located in the midbrain are the descending tracts. Remember, all descending tracts are considered motor. So these are white matter tracts that originate in the cerebrum, and they form the antermost part of the brain, midbrain. This is called the crus cerebri, which are basically the cortical spinal tracts. And also in the midbrain are two nuclei called the substantia nigri, posterior to the crus cerebri. It's a darkly pigmented region. These neurons work with the basal nuclei in the diencephalon to control movement. Substantia nigri neurons produce a substance called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. And dopamine is very important in the function of your basal nuclei. Okay, and a lack of dopamine will cause a condition referred to as Parkinson's. Parkinson's can be hereditary or it can be due to damage to the brain from head injuries. But the chief defect is the deficiency of dopamine by the injured area of the substantia nigri. The red nuclei, these are posterior to the substantia nigri. These communicate with the cerebellum, spinal cord, and the other regions. They're thought to be involved in regulating movement and posture, especially the postural control muscles. Also, you have many cranial nerve nuclei found in the midbrain. The midbrain tegmentum is a region of the midbrain between the cerebral aqueduct and the substantia nigra. They also contain numerous nuclei. Many are components of the reticular formation, as well as ascending and descending white matter tracts. The pons inferior to the midbrain, it consists of the descending motor tracts from the crus cerebri, some which then pass on through the pons en route to the spinal cord. The other tracts enter the cerebellum by way of the middle cerebellar peduncles, also found in the pons of the reticular formation, and some of the other cranial nerve nuclei located just posterior to the tracts. You'll find the reticular formation and the cranial nerve nuclei in all three regions of the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So the pontine tegmentum is surrounded by the middle cerebellar peduncles. You also have pontine nuclei that have roles in regulating movement, breathing, reflexes, especially the respiration reflexes, and complex functions associated with both sleep and arousal. Medulla oblongata, the inferior part of the brainstem, continues with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. You know you've reached the spinal cord when you go past the foramen magnum. The pyramids, they look like triangular pyramids. So they're on the interior or ventral surface of the medulla. They contain upper motor neuron fibers of the cortical spinal tracts, also called the pyramidal tracts, as they travel on their way from the cerebral cortex onto the spinal cord. Always remember, your motor tracts are always going to be found on the anterior side of the spinal cord, whereas the sensory fibers are found on the dorsal or posterior side of the spinal cord. Your right and left cortical spinal fibers will decussate within the pyramids. The motor fibers originating from the right side of the cerebral cortex will descend through the left side of the spinal cord, and vice versa. The motor fibers originating from the left side of the cerebral cortex will descend through the right side of the spinal cord. The posterior or dorsal columns, these are paired tracts of white matter found on the posterior side of the medulla, and they carry sensory information from the spinal cord to both the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. Always remember, sensory information, this is always ascending fibers. The nucleus gracilis is taking information from the lower extremities sensory information, and the nucleus cuneatus is taking sensory information from the upper extremities. But the dorsal columns are sensory. The dorsal columns or posterior columns also decussate. Decussate means to cross over within the medulla. So therefore, sensory information from the right side of the spinal cord is processed by the left side of the cerebrum and vice versa. That's the reason when an individual has had a stroke in the right frontal lobe, in the right primary motor cortex, they'll have left-sided symptoms like a weakness on the left side of their body. The olive is lateral to the pyramids. It's a protuberance that contains the inferior olivary nucleus. And this nucleus receives sensory fibers from the spinal cord and directs that information to the cerebellum. You also have several cranial nerve nuclei and reticular formation nuclei found also in the medulla. So this is the internal anatomy of the brainstem, showing you the features that we just went over from a lateral view and a cross-sectional view from the different regions of the midbrain on top here, pons in the middle, and medulla. Always remember the dorsal, posterior side will carry sensory. The ventral side will carry motor information. That's where you find the pyramids. There's a condition called locked-in syndrome. It's caused by damage to motor tracts of the pons, and when this condition, the individual cerebrum is unable to communicate with the spinal cord. So the patient has no purposeful movement that's possible, but the sensory pathways to the brain remain intact, as well as many of the other higher mental functions. So patients are therefore literally locked in their bodies. Yet they're fully aware of everything going on around them. Some can communicate using eye movements like a blink. One blink is for yes, two blinks is for no. But that's because the eye movements are controlled by the midbrain region. You do have a very small number of patients that have locked-in syndrome that do recover some motor functions, but most do not. The overall prognosis is poor. Most will generally succumb to their infections or other paralytic complications, especially from the paralysis of the respiratory structures. The reticular formation. This is a collection of over 100 nuclei found in the central core of the three brainstem subdivisions. So it's one of your more complex regions of your brain. So you have input received from multiple sources, including the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, as well as sensory stimuli from the body. Output is then sent through the entire brain as well as the spinal cord. There is central nuclei of the reticular formation in the center of the formation, function in sleep, transmission of pain, and mood. The nuclei surrounding the central nuclei serve many of the motor functions for skeletal muscle and autonomic nervous system functions. Other nuclei, instrumental in homeostasis of breathing and blood pressure. And then the lateral nuclei are important in sensation and alertness, as well as activity levels of the cerebrum. So this basically kind of reveals the sources of input from the cerebral cortex, as well as the limbic system by the orange fibers, and then the sensory stimuli input into the reticular formation and from the sensory information from the lower body. So these are all the different sources of input into the reticular formation. So those are your main brain structures and their functions. Okay, we're going to stop there.